Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this, where I am at least in Pretoria, a beautiful Thursday afternoon, the third of our three Friends briefings on the topic of our forthcoming 5-point plan to save rural South Africa. Its whole title being Land, Lives and Liberty, a 5-point plan to save rural South Africa. And we've covered some ground in the last 2 days. We started out with this idea of rural safety on the individual and on the community level. Yesterday I had and we spoke to Gideon Joubert about that, who is, he doesn't like it when we call him a gun rights activist, but he's certainly someone who seeks to promote responsible firearm ownership, training and usage. And that was a fascinating discussion. Feel free to check that out on Facebook or on YouTube. And then yesterday, I had a fascinating discussion with our in-house expert on 1980s action films and property rights. I mentioned these things in order of importance, of course. Terence Corrigan, who took us through, I think, 45 minutes in-depth overview, crash course in what you need to know about property rights. And today, our third and final guest is my colleague and our, local philosopher and all-around, Russophile, Gabriel Crouse, who has, to narrow down his interest in the agricultural community would be doing it a disservice. He has a lot of experience working with farmers, fighting with farmers, fighting for farmers, talking to farmers, the rural community. Not just to his heart, but to his impressive mind. So I will be picking that mind today. I'm Hermann Pretorius, the Deputy Head of Policy Research at the IRR, and without further ado, Gabriel, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Hermann. I'll take that introduction on the chin. Very flattering.
Well, yes, it's but I think it's fair. I assume you'll take it on the chin if we could find your chin. But looking at life in rural South Africa, it's very, I think people sometimes misunderstand why we care about policy, why we care about, theories and philosophy and ideas. It all boils down to life, the experience of human beings and whether they can achieve hopes, ambitions, and gain satisfaction. So to talk about life in rural SA, before we look at how it could be made better, could I perhaps ask you for your overview, from where you're sitting, if you look at life in rural South Africa in the year 2020, what do you see?
I see a multiplicity, and I think the first place to go to, the first particular aspect, is the third of South Africa, I would say. Around a third of South Africa is already Zimbabwe. What I mean by that is, if you look on the west half of the country, on the eastern half of the country, which is more productive, agriculturally speaking, you find that, I think in that region, it looks like maybe a majority, maybe close on a majority, maybe just under a majority of the land is held by the state. And people occupy that land basically as vassals of the state. And I'm not so much a Russophile as someone who has spent many years trying to understand Tsarist history and Soviet history in Russia, because I think there are a lot of cautionary tales to be learned from there. And basically what we have is a system that would have been very familiar to the Soviets, where people are considered incapable, for cultural reasons, of gainfully engaging in agricultural enterprise. And so the government paternalistically or maternalistically says, we're going to hold on to the land for you, because if you had it, we think you'd sell it, or we think you'd squander it, or we think you'd do the wrong thing with it. So we're going to hold on to that land for you, and we'll help you to farm in communities. So if you just look at state-owned land, there are an estimated 18 million South Africans living on state-owned land in rural South Africa. And then if you add to that the community property associations, the CPAs, which are not allowed effectively to partition their land, then that number climbs even higher. And I have seen personally at this stage tens of thousands of hectares of government-owned land that used to be effective commercial farmland. And I hear the same story over and again when I go there. We used to have a job. We wanted the land. Now we don't have a job and we don't have the land. The government has the land and the jobs have disappeared. And so we're in a very terrible situation. And, you hear these stories I was in a peach orchard where there was thousands of hectares large. I mean, it was one of the larger ones in the country. And after 5 years, there wasn't a peach growing anymore. Most of the trees had been knocked over. The drip irrigation system had been pulled apart. All of the brass levers and taps, copper kind of joints, everything had been removed. The plastic had been removed. So they hadn't been fed the water that they needed. So they died. To get that farm going again is going to take you at least 7 years. But it's worse than starting from scratch. Because if you had virgin land, as the technical term, you could just go out there and do basic land care, and then you could plant your orchard. But with this land, you've got these trees that are basically infertile at this point and dead, but they're obstructions to new planting. So you'd have to go and remove those trees. And if you look at the cost of a bulldozer to rent or to buy, if you look at the cost of the diesel to operate, it is it's hundreds of thousands per hectare just to clear the stuff out. And that's not the only kind of problem. Another kind of problem is contouring of farmland. So on the west half of the country, it's quite hilly often. And if you've got a bit of a hill and you want to graze cattle there, that's fine. But the water that comes down the hill when there's a heavy rainfall, combined with the foot traffic, will cause some erosion. So to preserve high quality felt grass, what you do is you cut a contour. You basically cut a little step halfway up the hill into the hill. And you put it at a bit of a gradient, so the water on the top half of the hill will flow down, and then it'll hit that step, and then it'll stream down, kind of like water hitting a gutter. And that protects both above and below, but especially below, you've got less water going through, so you're less likely to get a dike or a donga, basically a deep concavity, where raw earth is exposed and it's no longer useful for grazing or anything else. Now, here's the problem with a contour. You have to maintain it. Every year, you have to maintain your contour line. So here's what happens if you don't maintain it. There'll come a little point where there's a little divot, like a pothole. But because the contour line is gathering lots of water already, it's increasing the velocity and the volume of water that's coming down that channel. If there's a pothole, so to speak, on that contour line, you've got a lot of water cutting into it. And that makes it bigger. If you don't maintain it, then you are guaranteed to cut a deep crevice into the side of the hill. And I have seen scores of hills that are scarred like this. Now, once that happens, you've basically lost that for life. I mean, the amount of earth moving that you have to do to restore the fertility, as it were, of that land unit is just not going to be justified for at least a generation. And if I can add one more kind of just basic, and so these are stories about how things are worse than nothing. It's worse than just going into completely unused land. I was at a very large dam, like one of the largest private dams in the country, in KwaZulu-Natal. And this had not been maintained once the farm had been taken by the state, bought by the state. And what happened is someone stole, or some group stole, the brass tap at the bottom of the dam. So underneath the dam, to let the water through, to maintain the water levels that you want, you've got a big tap, basically. I mean, it's as large as a car, but it's a tap. and someone got in there and stole that tap. So now there's no longer a way to maintain the water level. So one thing that happens is the water gushes through all of the time. So a huge crevasse has been dug in at the bottom of the dam, which means even if you fix the dam water, everything downstream of it is pretty screwed up. And above it, what's happened is the water levels haven't been maintained for the last 7 years. And so I spoke to like a rural Zulu farmer who said he has seen dozens of cattle desperate in the middle of winter because the dam is not maintained. The water shrinks and the cattle push further and further through the mud to get to the actual little pool of water in the middle. And they get stuck and they die and their carcasses rot on the spot. And then when the rains come, that water is contaminated by carrion. So the whole ecosystem, the whole farming ecosystem is screwed up to the point where it's like, it's worse. He says, I wish there was no dam here. At least if there was no dam here, the cows wouldn't be tempted to do this. We try and police them, but we can't stop them from doing it. So basically, now farmers are keeping their cattle as far as they can from the dam, basically from late April, early May until October. So in that part of the country, in those parts of the country, and this is a serious portion of rural South Africa, unemployment rates are basically at Zimbabwean levels. You basically go from village to village. You can take a drive from Greytown or from Pietermaritzburg through Greytown all the way to Kalenzo. It's kind of up the, if you know the road from Johannesburg to Durban, if you basically take the parallel road to that further east, you just drive through a retirement village in the sense that almost no one has a job and you're born, your subsistence is on a social grant, you have kids, you get more subsistence from social grants, you reach a kind of pensioning age, you get more social grants. But in terms of work, you find very few people. I mean, there are hard industrious traders, brick manufacturers, but there's no access to capital. There's no capital, so there's no access to finance. And the market is already so depressed that there's very little that you can provide that isn't already being provided that people are going to buy because they're basically living very subsistence lives. So it's very quiet. And I think for a Soviet or a kind of old school Nazi, any kind of grand idea social engineer who thinks that urbanization, modern living, vibrant cultures, you know, people questioning each other, freedom of speech, this kind of slightly hostile city experience that we're all accustomed to. People who think that's the devil and that salvation is to return to a kind of state of Eden-like bucolic tranquility, you know, I think they probably could look on that as a success story. But if you speak to the people there and if you look at the lives they're living, it's not a success story. It's basically a prison that people try to escape to if they can, to cities like Johannesburg and Cape Town and Pretoria, much like Zimbabwe, and then to supply remittances to their families to just meet the basic needs of a human life. So yeah, a third of this country is Zimbabwe already, and I think that's hugely important. Then another third of the country, rural South Africa, is very sophisticated. Our farming sector is, I think it really is fair to say, one of the most sophisticated in the world. So we're not on the cutting edge of R&D, of research and development, of like, you know, the people who are figuring out how to genetically engineer fruit that can grow in the desert. They're mainly in Israel, and some of them are in California. Okay, the guys who are figuring out how to get a drip irrigation system run by an app that is computing weather inputs from global satellites. They're mainly in the US and in South Korea and in China and in Japan. We're not at the cutting edge of that drone technology, but we are at the cutting edge of the juice to squeeze ratio. You know, it's a very kind of simple idea. You've got a fruit. How much do you have to squeeze for how much juice do you get? And South Africa has managed to figure out how to squeeze all of the drops out with the kind of minimal input that you can use. Very, very efficient. And part of the reason for that is that, ironically, we've got one of the most liberalized farming sectors in the world, in the sense that it is not government sponsored. If you look at Japan, half of a rice farmer's income is government subsidy. If you look in the EU, averages around 40%, because the EU, in a sense, was started off as like a farm subsidization project. You look at various states in America, and you're seeing similar things going on. South Africa, because farmers were seen to be an enemy or a sort of ghostly apparition that has taken the place of the enemy amongst tripartite alliance ideologues, was not seen to be a credible industry to subsidize. Tariffs were brought down, millie boards were disbanded, and farmers were left to their own devices. Part of the thought being, this will drive farmers out of business, but it did exactly the opposite. Competition has really done a lot of good work for the South African farmer, and if you look at Stats SA's data, if you look at the South African Reserve Bank data, you find that farming in South Africa is one of the most middle-heavy sectors, in the sense that, a lot of South Africa, you look at South Africa's financial services industry, you look at some mining, and you see very few small players that have dominated the market. Some informal sector players that aren't really leveraging technology, finance, not necessarily on the tax grid either, who make up the rest, and a very weak middle. In farming, there has been somewhat of a shift towards larger farmers doing better. But if you look at the definition of a large farmer versus the definition of a large bank, it's several orders of magnitudes different. So, Stats SA defines a large farmer as someone who's generating more than 35 million rand turnover per annum. If you look in construction, financial services, mining, that would qualify you very much in the medium range, on the smaller end of the medium range. And those are the larger guys. So aside from a few standout cases, in general, South Africa's got a large, competitive, mid-sized farming sector, and most things are going right there. What's not going right is insecurity over property rights and insecurity over life itself. And that's something that's shared very much between both of those two sectors. And then the third is very quick and easy to go over. It's basically the desert and the kind of national parks, Addo, Kruger, tourist destinations, which usually are great, but obviously are having the worst year in living memory because of the COVID-19. So generally speaking, a lot of ambitious and decent people trying to eke out existence in a very interesting country from a climatic point of view. So many biomes, so many opportunities to do good, so much ecological diversity. But it's heavy going out there. And I think the only reason that anyone's surviving is because so many rural South Africans are tough as nails.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to keep the question short because I found that fascinating, and I would like you to speak in your mind on fully exploring these topics. But when you say these thirds, and you speak about the more sophisticated farming communities or South Africa segment or whatever we want to call it versus the more rural, the more underdeveloped, are they neatly geographically grouped, like this cluster here, that's the developed people, or are they islands within streams of each other?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think they're very interstitched. It's like polka dots, and in some places the polka dot will be like a successful commercial farm that's still going, but is surrounded by a series of government land claims farms that have become moribund. And in other cases, it'll be, a series of commercial farms that are going well, and then one that's been that's now in government ownership and is not actually doing any good work. So there are different pressures on both sides. One generalization is the following, and I'm assuming our listeners will be familiar with this. About, let's say, 2 to 5% of South African farmland has been lost, as farmers like to say, to urban and peri-urban development. So one commonality is if you look around small towns in the countryside, immediately around those towns, it's more often that you'll find moribund land than commercially viable land at this stage. And that's because immediately around towns, you're more likely to face severe stock theft, severe crop theft, and basically land invasions. I think it's important to just note, Dan Plato said something very interesting recently. He said that in the last 2 years, Cape Town has lost 360 hectares of land to illegal land invasions. So
this is after the president said land invasions will not happen. Land grabs will not happen. The ANC won't stomach it.
And this is in one of the parts of the country where rule of law is the most maintained, and also that's the most transparent, which is why we know. We don't have good data on how much land has been illegally taken alongside highways, major highways leading out of Johannesburg, for example, and around little towns. But that is, it's almost comic. It's kind of tragic if you sort of pick a little town in a high growth area, a place that's good for growing food, and you go around it, you'll find a variety of strategies that commercial farmers use in order to protect themselves, their families, and their places of business. So a very common strategy is the moat. You get a large bulldozer and you plow a moat 1 meter to 2.5 meters deep for 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers, however long your farm border is. And then you use that soil on the one side to have a bit of a hill, and then there's the moat. And then no one can easily drive their cattle to feed on your crops. No one can easily steal your crops and use that means of egress to get out. And it's like medieval. And next to the moats, you often find, or along the moats, you often find watchtowers where farm workers will be stationed to survey the property and check for stock theft and crop theft. And sometimes you get patrols. And I've spoken about, I went chasing mealie thieves once. They managed to just get away. I wanted to ask them what was going on because I'd spoken to several farmers in a part of the Northern Free State who were saying, if you look at if you look at 0.5 ton to 2 tons worth of mealies being stolen in one night, then you can't come and say that this is a hungry guy who's just looking to steal a mealie to put it over some boiling water and eat. This is a sophisticated operation. So I went looking for some mealie thieves in the hopes that they would give me some background information on how that kind of operation works. Didn't manage to work out on that front, but I did speak to some people who drive around in bakkies with balaclavas over their heads, with shotguns and rifles in their hands, looking for mealie thieves. And I suppose because it's so easy to get the wrong idea about race, it's worth saying that all of these vanguards of protecting capital were black and were very incensed at the thought that you can tell by someone's race what their view on property rights will be. Their conviction was very much that some people want to take, some people want to make, and that's the division that they really care about, and they want to be on the maker's side, and so they want to protect a business that's making value, that's making food for the nation, and that creates a surplus that can hire them to protect it. Of course, they also expressed serious mistrust in the police, which I think has become one of the deepest problems in South Africa that we don't always talk about, or that when we talk about a lot, but that you don't hear enough about in the mainstream media. And it's the fact that the proportion of South Africans that trust the police force is a minority. That is one of the greatest minority there is. The Institute of Security Studies found that the police are, I think, the least trusted institution in South Africa. And that's nowhere more obvious than in rural South Africa, where almost no one speaks of the police as a guardian. They speak of the police as sort of somewhere between incompetent, lazy, and in on the take, and actually part of the problem. And that's a hard thing to reform. But I think it's vital, because without doing that, you don't really begin to deal with the other problems until there's security, and until people are secure in their bodies, in their minds, and in their property.
One thing that is interesting to me is, and something I think might be misunderstood even by people like ourselves, is, I mean, the Labour Party used this slogan, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. And now crime in rural South Africa, like that theft of a ton or two of mealies, is that pushed into manifestation by economic deprivation? Let me put it simply, would jobs, we'll get to how to create them, but would the creation of jobs lead to a corresponding decline in these kind of crime pressures?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I'll start with no, with a particular anecdote, and I'll extrapolate from that. This really moved me when I saw it. I was on a farm that had been bought by one of the country's most commercial, a very successful strawberry farmer. Okay, he wanted to relocate his laborers on a farm that was sufficiently large for them to be able to do some gardening and to actually run some stock. And so he did this, built them homes, bought this land, gave them the land, and this was his sort of role to play in the transformation process. And it settled sort of tensions between land claimants and migrant laborers, and so on, tenant laborers and so on. So everything was going well. He installed them with the infrastructure that they needed in order to have to get something viable going, including a water tank, two, one for personal usage and one for farming purposes. Both were stolen. He then reinstalled the one for personal usage, saying, I'll put the other one in if you guys can help me find the guys who did it. The next one was stolen too. So he said, I can't keep resupplying you with water tanks. I mean, these things are expensive every time. They're large pieces of equipment. But I'll help you get the government to set you up, because the government is supposed to be reticulating your water and servicing you with electricity in any case. And he'd help them through the paperwork process to get the electricity going, so he helped them with the water. That water tank was then stolen. The government's installed water tank was stolen too. So then they installed a fourth water tank and put bolts. They basically welded the bolts down so that you couldn't remove the water tank. What happened? Someone took a panga and slashed the water tank so that it's not usable. Now, I spoke to the members of this community who were, I don't know, they'd been part of the leadership in the community and had kind of given up. And they said, this is the way it works. You've got older people, for the most part, who are conservative. They are focused on work, on value add, on church, on respecting their ancestors, on respecting traditions, on maintaining what's good and adding to it. And then you've got youth who are focused on burning everything down. Now, not all of the youth are like this. One of the people I spoke to was young as well, and she had been trying to lead the community from the younger perspective. But after the threats she'd gotten got to the point of a dead pet, blood on the door, she was like, I'm out of this too. So I think that if you think just about this problem as being one of poverty, then you're missing out on the anarchic, often race baiting, aggressive, militant side that instigates a lot of destruction, not even theft, just destruction. If you look at the number of tires that are burnt, the number of libraries are burnt, the number of fire engines that are burnt, the people doing that are antisocial first and foremost, and one does have to be tough on that. The second caveat is that jobs, I think there's a mistake in this country of talking too loosely about jobs. A sinecure is also a job. You can be paid to sit on your hands, and that is technically a job. Now, my Zulu's not good enough to articulate this point, but Gigi Alcock, who I think is seriously someone to listen to, he grew up in Msinga, in rural KZN. Zulu is his first language, and he's a marketing expert, and so has done a lot of commercial work to understand South Africa's markets. Much like us, from a political point of view, he does from a commercial point of view. And he's noticed that a lot of Zulu speakers in particular will say, I don't have a job, even if they are earning 50,000 Rand a month running an extremely successful spaza shop or little network of spaza shops. And there's a cognate here of umsebenzi and ngasebenza or something that I'm not going to get right. But in English, the translation is, I don't have a job, I work. So if I'm a guy who goes and I sell guenas, I sell food on the side of the road, and I'm getting 20,000 Rand turnover a month, which means I get to keep 5,000 Rand. Or I'm a guy running a large spazarette, which then supplies others, and I'm getting 200,000 Rand turnover a month. So I'm actually taking home 30,000 Rand, and I can go buy a bucky in cash. They'll both say, I don't have a job, I work. And I think the thing is to add opportunities to work, to add value. And it can be, in rural South Africa, it can be everything from arts and crafts, to, the desperately beautiful attempts to use straw and beads to make something beautiful, to teaching in a way where you're actually teaching, not collecting a salary and skipping Friday work because you had Puza Thursday. It's very natural for people to want to teach, but we have a problem in rural South Africa in particular, where SATU-dominated schools incentivize lethargy, loyalty, and lugubriousness, and disincentivize actual value add. So the real thing you need to do is incentivize work, is to make opportunities for work, and to disincentivize and punish those who break other people's stuff, their futures, their hopes, and their bodies.
So how do we do that?
Yeah, so one thing to harp on about and repeat, because it's serious, is you've got to privatize government-owned land. There's this wonderful little factoid in the air this week about the fact that a municipality has tried to settle 2.5 billion rands worth of debt by giving 139 farms to Eskom. Okay, I don't know what Eskom's going to do with those farms. I don't know how many farmers there are in Eskom who can tell you how to go from pulling 4 tons per hectare of mealies on dry land to 20 tons. But I suspect, given everything else Eskom's done in the last while, not that many successful commercial farmers in the enterprise, right? The municipality shouldn't have had those farms in the first place. You've got to privatize. 20 million South Africans cannot be living in Zimbabwean Soviet states of paternalism. But it's not enough to do that. The national cadaster has to be reformed. There are serious numbers of people who feel reluctant even to take on a title deed, because the infrastructure, the bureaucracy operating that system is often corrupt, and you might have to pay a bribe in order to get the transfer of the title deed on top of the costs that you have to pay through the legal offices. I think if we want to subsidize anything, we should be subsidizing low-cost rural households title transfer costs. Someone passes away and they actually owned a 500-hectare small farm, or they owned their house in rural South Africa that used to be an RDP house. You know, if you own a house that's only worth 60,000 Rand and you have to pay 20,000 Rand to the cadaster effectively to get it transferred, it's a heavy duty. I think better to subsidize that a little bit than to stay hoarding the land. That would be a serious thing. Another serious thing is you've got to get the police to be serious about the operation. The first story I covered for the Institute of Race Relations was in Ikutuleni, where some Lutheran Zulus had been sitting on land that they'd been on for a century, and they filed from 95 for permission to occupy, and then they filed for a title deed. They got that title deed 20 years later, and shortly around that time, they were driven out by an impi. They say under Tandazane Zulu, a chief who has also been accused of assassinating people, who, yeah, many nasty allegations running around his head. The allegations are centered on him pursuing mineral rights. Anyway, the police were there. This is common cause. The police were there the morning that the impi threatened to chase them out of house and home, and the police escorted them out of their house and home, and then watched as these homes were set on fire. And the minister in the church, Charles Nkomalo, who was chased out there, it was his daughter's wedding coming up in a few days. So he had, you know, like the biggest party of his life in terms of booze and meat, all taken and enjoyed by the looters. And his daughter's wedding dress, a very serious investment, burnt for him to see. And still, these people, the Mnyandus and Nkomalo, are in hiding. They can't go back to a place for which they have a title deed. So a title deed is the first part of the story. The second part of the story is you have to reform you've got to get the bureaucracy working efficiently and in a way that's appealing for poor people to buy into. And thirdly, you've got to get the police actually enforcing title. You can't have rugby fields. You can't have 2 rugby fields a day being stolen on the fringes of Cape Town and nothing happens about it. You can't have, I don't know how much, multiply that out in more rural South Africa and deal with that. And anyway, I think if you deal with those issues to start off with, policing, getting the bureaucracy right, and getting the title deeds, those are the lowest hanging fruit in a way. And then the next tier up is to deal with the service extension services, to deal with the infrastructure. You know, it's hard to get your goods to market if there's not a viable road. It's hard to sell your goods. It costs more to take a mealie from Bloemfontein to Durban than it does to take it from Durban Harbour to Brazil. So why is that? Well, it's because our rail network has completely collapsed. So you have to do almost all food freight on roads. It's not good. It's not a long-term solution. So you want to sort out the harbors, you want to sort out the roads, and all of that could be done. I mean, I think we've got the construction expertise in this country to make that happen. If you line up the incentives right, so that you've got a properly competitive bidding process, that's not an exercise in cadre deployment behind the fig leaf of BEE, but is actually, like I said, an exercise in like, we want to incentivize work. Who can get there first, best, cheapest? Will fly. I think that we have, yeah, we're in a very strong position to be providing raw agricultural goods domestically and to our neighbors, to be providing sophisticated high-end goods, the wines that we're famous for, to the rest of the world. Also, citrus is huge. And we're growing avocados. You know, we are expanding our market. We also have huge potential to expand manufacturing of food products. And if you look at the South African manufacturing sector, it is one of the hardest hit sectors in the entire Zuma-Ramaphosa debacle. And the most resilient part of South African manufacturing has been food manufacturing. So processing your beans, putting them in cans, processing mealies, processing all of these foodstuffs, meat, and exporting it into the rest of Africa. This has been, even in the worst of times, a viable way to do business, because you've got a continent to the north of us that is finally getting past the sort of worst throes of socialism and decolonial kind of panic. You're getting real value add going in Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, and especially in Nigeria. You've got many fast-moving consumer goods providers in this country, and food retailers, grocers, deepening their footprint. I mean, there's been a lot of retraction in the last year and a half, but that is a good model for how to develop South Africa's value add proposition to the rest of the world. Is to say, not only are we going to be the only food secure country on the continent of Africa, which we still are, but we're gonna add value to that food, and that creates a lot of jobs in itself, and sophisticated jobs. You know, if you're a diesel mechanic who has to work on trucks or trains that are delivering freight, if you're a sort of flop-shore manager who's watching the cardboard processing plant get going, timber here, there's a lot of opportunity for real value add work. And then just to get back to the basics, I mean, part of the reason that fruit is so exciting is that we are still in a place where we can harvest fruit economically by hand and package it. Because when you're harvesting a peach or a table grape, you basically need someone to pluck that peach or table grape and to put it in its individual little like friendly polystyrene cocoon, and then to repackage it into a larger one at the storehouse for it then to be exportable to America or Russia or the UK, EU. So I mean, these are, yeah, when I go through places where they're like, yeah, 5 years ago we had 5,000 people working here. Today, you know, there's some guy who runs his goats and his cattle. He's the municipal manager's like son-in-law, and other than that, there's like the old farmhouses are being occupied by the new claimants who do employ domestic servants. So 500 jobs has gone down to 12. Another way of thinking about that is we could go from 12 to 500 quite quickly. Now, that's not going to mean that Zimbabwe, the third of South Africa that's currently Zimbabwe, is going to turn into South Korea overnight, or into you know, the most productive valleys in Israel or California overnight. But it does mean that you make an immediate and concrete difference to the lives of people who today sleep without hope and without an event horizon. Every day is like the last. I think it's cruel and unusual to put a person in a position where hope and future-oriented planning is punished, because the system is so capricious, so arbitrary, so violent, that the only sane way to survive is to stop thinking about tomorrow. And if you turn that around, you know, it's very natural for people to think about tomorrow, plan for tomorrow. I think you'll see a lot of other social ills cool down as young men take their energies away from burning and towards trying to see, how can I outcompete my neighbor? How can I make the same number of apples but using less cost? That's also a competitive thing. And yeah, if you harness that, I think it's good for mental health. I think it's good for drunken debauchery. I think it's good for getting people to think about planning families, actually, you know, having a husband and wife stay together, investing for their children, the kinds of social goods that older conservative, particularly Black South Africans, talk about missing, talk about as the thing that's gone missing in the last 10 years. I think those things are natural things that can be returned as readily as grass returns to green when the sun shines. It's the obstacle in between that makes for this perverse situation of the loudest, angriest young men who burn things down, dominating the dominating first and foremost, terrorizing the communities they live in, and then dominating the conversation at the public square level, where it becomes a thought of either you must just give away all land, chase away all commercial farmers, see what you can do with that, or keep on going as we're going, where you do have productive commercial farmers, but you also have lawlessness, murders, and huge levels of mistrust.
So, Gabriel, I think a last question before we wrap up, and you sketch this picture of potential, and you speak about this obstacle to change, and I think we can agree that the obstacle to change has been a failed government, a failed centralized government with all the ideological ills. But we as South Africans, people who might be listening to our conversation, watching our conversation, what cards do we have to play? What's our leverage here as South Africans? What's our ammunition to actually assail this obstacle and get rid of it?
Good. So I think the one that's most ready to hand is your own voice, your own hand. I was just in Newcastle 2 weeks ago, after the murder of Glenn and Vida Rafferty, close to Normandin. Saturday night, they'd just been out with some friends. On their way home, they're assailed, and the descriptions that I've heard from people who have first or second-hand access to the video footage is not just gruesome, it's also very perplexing. As far as we can tell, almost nothing was stolen. Well, the safe keys were there in the Rafferty's possession, on their person. There were 7 dogs on the property, only 1 was shot. So it's very hard to understand this as a theft, and it's very hard to understand this as anything other than like pure evil, partly because they were such good friends of the community. And so this awful thing happened, and we went down to go and see a protest, kind of commemoration. And it was amazing to see. All it cost the 3,000 odd people who were there was a few hours of time, a little bit of petrol to get there. But actually going there to meet together and to have this diverse, in terms of creed, color, class, this diverse group of people coming together and saying, we all find this unacceptable. We all want this to stop. We all want this never to happen again. It should never have happened in the first place. This was a powerful message. It was so much more powerful than burning something down. It is so much more powerful than spewing hate and vitriol. It was a show of solidarity that, to anyone who paid attention to it, busts open the myths of how we are divided against each other. There's a vast majority of South Africans in this country that are sitting in the same position as that woman I described with the water tank that was slashed by a machete. We cannot do what we need to do because vandals, looters, thugs, and sadists actually are cruelly terrorizing us. But if you just put your voice out there, and especially if you can go out to a peaceful protest, I think you do a lot of good. I think that this government understands peaceful protest very well, and I think it makes them nervous. And I think this is a big part of the reason that it's the first time that we've seen the ANC speak out harshly and in no uncertain terms about farm murders. Yes, you might worry about the hypocrisy of David Mabuza and his legacy, but for them to say that is a sign of what pressure does, and it's a good step in the right direction. I think the next thing that we unfortunately have to take very seriously is the real means by which government stigmatizes farmers in this country is by calling all farmers thieves, guilty of some genetic sin, some sin that you inherit by birth, a sin of ancestors that you must be punished for. It's a very, in every culture in the world, on every continent, there has been this idea of punishing the sons for the sins of their fathers, and it's never worked out well, and it's not common sense, and most South Africans are not for that. We can tell because of our statistical research, and we can tell because of our visits to rural South Africa. But we are terrorized by the loudest noisemakers into silence. And as long as the dominant narrative in the public square is that all farmers are land thieves, and it's only quietly, personally, where we say, no, that's not true, then the stigma on the farmer remains. And that's bad for farmers. It's also bad for the unemployed, because as long as you have this question mark hanging over property rights, no one wants to invest here. So I really think that at some point, South Africans are going to have to think very seriously about having peaceful, disciplined, compassionate, consolidated protests for property rights and against expropriation without compensation. And there has been one just before COVID-19 and the lockdown in KZN, close to Pietermaritzburg. There was a formal, well-organized, peaceful protest, cross-class, cross-color, cross-creed. People just got together and they said, we do not want to live under a government that's going to take our stuff. And it was covered in the local news, and maybe it would have been picked up, but the state of emergency was immediately declared, and then we were into lockdown, and our attention was all grasped by something else. But that's something to pay attention to. If we are going to, if expropriation without compensation comes down on South African agriculture, it comes down on all of South Africa. And if that happens without us actually going to the streets, then I think we are also complicit. I mean, you and I, Hermann, we have worked hard to draw attention to the issue of EWC, and we are not alone. How many is it? 600,000 South Africans have, if you add up the various petitions, joined the Institute of Race Relations to say no to EWC. If we could just get 10% of those people who've already made their voices heard to stand up and say no to EWC in the public square, I think we'd have a great win. Hermann?
Yes, Gabriel, that was. I see our time has expired, but I couldn't stop you. It was just riveting. So I hope our listeners and our audience will forgive us. I think a last remark from my side before I bring our chat to a close is, with our recent campaign on prescribed assets, something that really struck with me. I had a conversation with our head honcho, Frans Cronier, and we spoke a bit, and I realized something, that you win the battle of ideas by claiming words and by making words either worthy and good pursuits or toxic. And the problem is the word farmer hasn't been won. The word farming community, the concept farming community hasn't been won. The word property rights hasn't been won. These words can still fall either way, either become toxic. Perhaps some words like farmer and farming community and farm worker have already started nudging towards toxicity. But there's a conversation happening, and if we can at least win the sentiment of a word, as esoteric and philosophical as it sounds, if we can change what people think when they hear farmer, if we can change what people think when they hear property rights, I think that's how we win. And I think that's where peaceful protests, claiming of concepts in the public sphere, becomes a powerful tool. Gabriel, thank you so much. It has been an absolute joy. I learned a lot. It was incredibly insightful, and I hope we do another one of these soon. And to our listeners and our friends and our supporters and anyone exploring these ideas with us, what I especially appreciate about my conversation with Gabriel is no one can think that he's an ivory tower researcher. We go out there, we speak to people, he try to stop mealy thieves, and there's a battle going on of ideas, and the fact that you are supporting us, joining us, it means a lot, and I think it fills me with hope that we can win this. It won't be hard, but I think if we remember that your liberty is worth fighting for, I think we might just be all right. Thank you, everyone, and God bless.
Amen.